Hello, everyone. Welcome to A Good Night for a Murder, a Victorian true crime podcast. My name is Kim, and towards the end of 2024, I released a lot of fun bonus content, a compilation episode covering multiple stories, and even strayed into the Edwardian era a little bit. But tonight, for the first episode of the new year, I want to get back to the show's roots with a classic Victorian murder case where some very interesting investigation methods were deployed. This is the story of Sarah Jane Roberts. But first, a Victorian Society tip. A lot has changed since the Victorian era. One thing that seems to have stayed the same, though, is that after the holidays, despite the piles of new toys and books and projects they've received, our kids will complain that they're bored. And we, as parents, as much as we love our kids, get sick and tired of hearing about it. Turns out, parents 150 years ago had this problem too. However, as we know, Victorians had rules on how to handle any situation, and bored kids were no different. In 1882, Daniel Carter Beard, who would go on to found the Boy Scouts of America, published the American Boy's Handybook, What to Do and How to Do It. The book is divided into activities by season and includes instructions for 16 kinds of kites, how to make fishing tackle, how to make and stock both fresh and saltwater aquariums, how to camp out without a tent, everything from provisions to shelter to choosing your companions, how to build 10 kinds of boats, making bird calls, training a dog, novelties and soap bubbles, every boy his own soap bubble pipe, how to rear wild birds, make blowguns, practical taxidermy for boys, mind reading, snowball warfare, and more. Since it's winter, let's dive a little bit more into the rules for snowball warfare. Rules of the game. The rules of warfare governing a snowball battle are as follows. 2 commanders or captains must be elected. If the forces engaged be very large, each captain may appoint 1 or 2 assistants or lieutenants. These officers, after being elected and appointed, are to give all orders and should be promptly obeyed by their respective commands. The captains decide by lot the choice of each position. Each party will have its national colors, in addition to which the attacking party has a battle flag which it carries with it in the assault. The defenders of the fort must see to it that all damage to the fortifications are promptly repaired. Any soldier from the fort who shall be carried off within the limits of the camp becomes a prisoner of war and cannot leave the camp until rescued by his own comrades. Any one of the attacking force pulled into the fort becomes a prisoner of war and must remain in the fort until it is captured. Prisoners of war cannot be made to fight against their own side, but they may be employed in making snowballs or repairing damages to fortifications. Any deserter recaptured must suffer the penalty of having his face washed with snow and being made to work with the prisoners of war. Honestly, these are all very reasonable rules. The winter chapter goes on to cover snow houses and statuary, by which they mean building snowmen. For some reason, though, they specifically recommend building a herd of snow pigs in one's yard, which has certainly never occurred to me before, so I think I'm going to need to try it out. Additional sections include instructions for various styles of sleds, snowshoes, and a variety of ice wings, which are like handheld kites meant to pull one across a frozen lake on ice skates. This chapter also covers ice fishing and spearing, and building a shanty for said fishing and spearing. Indoor amusements for boys include, as mentioned earlier, mind reading, which in this case is more of a magic show, a detailed outline for forming a literary sketch club, where members all perform sketches on similar theme or topics, a script for putting on a play of Puss in Boots, how to make a kaleidoscope, and more. I know what you've been thinking since I started talking about the American Boy's Handybook, though. Was there an American Girl's Handybook? Great news, there was. It came along in 1892 and was titled The American Girl's Handybook, How to Amuse Yourself and Others. Because in 1892, what else were girls good for besides the amusement of others? Written by sisters Lena and Adelia Beard, who were active women's rights advocates and founders of the Girl Scouting movement, the foreword to the book states, "Healthy and spirited, the American girl thinks nothing of taking a 10-mile romp through the woods and fields with a group of friends and collects flowers and leaves for preservation or presentation to friends and relations." Like the American Boy's Handybook, the Girl's Handybook is organized into sections by season and covers, quote, projects, devices, toys, gifts, dolls, recipes, decorations, perfumes, wax and clay modeling, oil and watercolor painting, and games, all with clear and practical directions for how to make and play them. One difference I noted between the two books is that the girls' book is further organized by holiday, which is no surprise given the expectations placed on women and girls to fulfill domestic roles during the Victorian era. Once we get through that, further sections are titled Home Gymnasium, a few items on old-fashioned needlework with some new and original patterns, scrapbook and homemade book covers, window decoration, homemade candy, and more. Let's skip to a section that caught my attention called A Heap of Rubbish and What to Do with It. This section starts out, in almost every house, there's an attic, and in almost every attic may be found a room where trunks are stored, where broken toys and disabled furniture are put out of sight, and where all articles not worth selling or giving away gradually accumulate until this attic room contains literally a heap of rubbish. Entering one of these lumber rooms not long ago and glancing over the medley, which comprised so much from a tin can to a piece of broken bric-a-brac, the thought occurred to me that something might be done with it, some use be made of at least a few of the articles consigned to the place as utterly useless. That was a rather thrifty thought. Do you not think so, girls? Then let us make the most of it and together venture back into that mysterious and somewhat dusty chamber and see if there really is anything worth making over. They're talking about upcycling here. Instructions follow for reframing an old mirror or making a tiered table out of old trays and more. I'm sure that some of the things Victorians had in their attics are what we have in our thrift and antique stores today. In fact, a lot of the ideas put forth in these books for both boys and girls still hold up, and it just reminds me that no matter how far we've come, in some respects, we're not really all that different either. Before we dive in, I have some new Patreon welcomes to share this month. Welcome to first-time members Jennifer, Hannah, Emily, and Adriana. Thank you so much for supporting the podcast. I am so glad you're here. A Good Night for a Murder is a true crime podcast that does cover stories including death, violence, sexual assault, and other adult themes. Please take care while listening. Sarah Jane Roberts was born on March 6, 1862, in Henlon, Devonshire, Wales. Her parents were Hugh and Elizabeth Roberts, and it sounds like she had at least 2 brothers and 1 sister. In 1880, when she was 18, Sarah Jane took a job as a domestic servant in the Greenwood household located in Arborhay of Manchester, Greater Manchester, England. The Greenwood house consisted of only Mr. and Mrs. Greenwood, a couple in their 70s. The home was semi-detached, meaning it was half of one building split down the middle. The other half of the house was occupied by the Cadman family. In this case, the 2 homes were joined through their kitchens. Sarah Jane had been with the Greenwoods since about March of that year, so about 10 months or so. While she was there, Mrs. Greenwood became sick and had been bedridden for the past few months. But Sarah Jane was a responsible and reliable caregiver, and the Greenwoods were happy to have her. The only peculiar thing they noticed was that Sarah Jane received a lot of letters. Like, a lot. Mrs. Greenwood thought she must be corresponding with suitors. Due to her young age, Mrs. Greenwood thought this was not proper and forbid her from entertaining any suitors while under her employ. And Sarah Jane had no problem with this. She said she didn't have any suitors, nor even any male friends. But still, she received a lot of letters. On January 7th of 1880, a somewhat mysterious letter arrived, not for Sarah, but for her employer, Mr. Greenwood. The letter had been hand-delivered, separate from the day's post, and had been dropped in through the mail slot. A colleague of Mr. Greenwood's found it in the foyer and handed it to Sarah Jane, joking that a love letter had arrived for her. It was clearly addressed to Mr. Greenwood, so she handed it over to him and went about her business. The letter was from one W. Wilson of Oldham Road and requested that Mr. Greenwood meet with him that evening at the 3 Tuns Inn in town regarding some property he owned that the writer was interested in purchasing. Mr. Greenwood did not know any W. Wilson of Oldham Road, but he was open to whatever he had to say, and he departed the house at about 5:20 in the evening to meet them. This left only Sarah Jane and Mrs. Greenwood in the house. Shortly after he left, Mrs. Greenwood called to Sarah Jane to assist her with something up in her room. Sarah Jane tended to Mrs. Greenwood, then headed downstairs to wash up in the kitchen. About 10 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. From her room upstairs, Mrs. Greenwood heard Sarah Jane answer the door and let someone into the house, who followed her through the hallway into the kitchen. Their footsteps were so light, Mrs. Greenwood assumed it must be a female servant friend of Sarah Jane's. She was surprised to then hear Sarah Jane speaking in a conversational tone to a man. She couldn't make out what they were saying, but they were not speaking in raised voices like they were having a disagreement or anything. They sounded like they could have been discussing the weather for all she knew. The next thing she heard, though, was a loud thud from the kitchen door slamming shut and then a piercing scream from Sarah Jane. Mrs. Greenwood, who had been unable to move from bed for weeks, was so alarmed she managed to heave herself out of the bed and to the top of the stairs where she called out for Sarah Jane. But she was met with silence. At this, she staggered her way downstairs to the front door, opened it, and screamed murder. Though she admitted later that at the time, she really had no idea what was going on. She thought Sarah Jane had suffered some sort of fit or had caught her clothes on fire. She only yelled murder as she thought it would be the quickest way to draw attention for help. The neighbor in the adjoining house, Mrs. Cadman, heard Mrs. Greenwood and rushed over. Together, the two women hurried to the kitchen and found Sarah Jane unconscious on the floor and bleeding from her head. Mrs. Cadman rushed back out for help and crossed paths with another neighbor, Mr. Halling. He had also heard the scream and also a splash come from the nearby water pit. By water pit, they mean a cesspool, which before plumbing or sewers was just a hole in the ground that everyone emptied their human waste into. Mr. Halling thought the scream came from a mother whose child had fallen into the water pit. When he encountered Mrs. Cadman, she begged him to come help Mrs. Greenwood's servant, who had been attacked and nearly killed. The two of them rushed back into the Greenwoods' home, and Mr. Halling tried to awaken Sarah Jane, but it was too late. Sarah Jane would actually never regain consciousness. Meanwhile, fully unaware of the horrifying events happening back in his house, Mr. Greenwood had arrived at the Three Tuns Inn looking for this W. Wilson character. But it appeared he was a no-show. No such person by that name was there. Knowing what we know about what had transpired that evening at the Greenwood home, this seems awfully suspicious. Mr. Greenwood ended up hanging around the pub for an hour or so before heading home to find his house in utter chaos. At this point, police and a doctor had arrived and Sarah Jane had been declared dead. The inquest, which concluded on January 23, 1880, would return a verdict of willful murder by person or persons unknown. Her cause of death, pretty obviously, was a skull fracture so violent that it broke her skull into 5 separate pieces. She also suffered a number of self-defense wounds on her hands and arms. Interestingly enough, nothing in the kitchen or adjoining rooms had been disturbed, and there was even a large sum of money in a room adjacent to where the murder took place that was untouched. This ruled out robbery as a motive. From Mrs. Greenwood's testimony, it was gathered that Sarah Jane had let this person in willingly, leading investigators to believe it was someone she knew and that Sarah Jane herself was indeed the target. But why? The assumption was it must be some romantic interest, but her belongings were searched and no letters of an amorous nature were found. Although, in hindsight, there may have been something up. Her sister noted that about 2 months ago, Sarah Jane mentioned there were 2 different young men who were interested in paying her a visit, but she wanted nothing to do with either of them. Also, Mrs. Greenwood noticed that Sarah Jane had stopped leaving the house on her days off recently. At the time, Sarah Jane said she just didn't feel right leaving Mrs. Greenwood when she was unwell, but perhaps there was actually something or someone she was avoiding. The letter received by Mr. Greenwood asking him to leave the house to meet someone who did not exist was considered a decoy, but it would ultimately turn out to be a dead end. In fact, the police would run up against several dead ends throughout their investigation. They were never able to recover the murder weapon, and there were multiple false confessions. Police spent a lot of time looking into a pair of men who several witnesses saw in the area of the Greenwood home that day. That in itself doesn't sound too suspicious, but we have a murder case on our hands here, and the investigators had few leads at the time anyway. One of the men, Robert Waite, lived in the area with his wife and young child, but left the day after the murder with his friend Thomas Laycock. It seems the pair were planning to immigrate to Australia, and there was actually a warrant out for Waite due to his using an alias on his immigration paperwork. His handwriting was said to be a close match for the note Mr. Greenwood received, and his landlady did say she laundered some clothes for him after the murder, though she couldn't say if they did or did not have blood on them. In the end, there was just not enough evidence to hold him for the crime. It sounds like all he was guilty of was trying to walk out on his wife and baby and had the unfortunate timing of doing so the day after a murder happened in town. With no murder weapon, no suspects, and no understanding of a motive, investigators decided to try a tactic that was used occasionally in early Victorian police work. They decided to try and capture the last thing Sarah Jane saw by removing her eyes. This was called forensic optography. In 1876, physiologist Franz Christian Boll discovered rhodopsin, a visual pigment in the retina of the eye that bleaches out in light but regains its purple hue in the dark. Another physiologist, William Frederick Kuhn, found a way to lock the bleached out rhodopsin in place. His theory was that one could then photograph the retina and magnify the result to produce an image that would allow us to see whatever that person saw right before their vision went entirely black, meaning right before they died. It's an interesting theory that would be great if it worked. The late 19th century saw scientific and technological discoveries in leaps and bounds. Advancements in photography had come a long way, and they'd recently just begun to understand that the eye also had a lens and our retina functioned sort of like the aperture of a camera. Perhaps the two were not so far apart. This reasoning led to some very interesting experiments by Kuhn. Kuhn said he did have some success with his experiments in rabbits, but even his best results were debatable. This didn't stop him from testing his theory on human subjects who were to be executed, though. However, the scientific community agreed those results were really nothing to write home about. Police use developing technologies all the time, though, and this was no exception. They deployed the technique on a number of cases, including Sarah Jane Roberts. The day before she was buried, police went ahead and opened Sarah Jane's coffin to remove her eyes in hopes they will be able to see an image of her killer, just as she had before she died. Unfortunately, as the Manchester Courier reported, there was nothing visible which would furnish the slightest evidence as to the features of the murderer. If you're interested in hearing about if this technique ever did actually work, I've covered that in the bonus content for this episode over on Patreon. So, unfortunately, no further progress would be made on this case. Superintendent Bent, head of the investigating police force, stated he was confident they knew the identity of the killer, but would not be able to present sufficient evidence to convict. Sadly, the case remains unsolved. On the day of Sarah Jane's funeral, it said over 1,000 people lined the streets. She was buried in the Christchurch Arborhay churchyard in Arborhay. A public collection was made to engrave and place an Aberdeen red marble headstone for her. It's quite a striking headstone, and I do have photos of it on Instagram and the episode blog on my website. I'm curious to know what you think about this case, though. Do you think police actually knew who it was? And what do you think about the experimental eye technique? If you head over to Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube at A Good Night for a Murder, you can let me know there. I've also posted photos of police illustrations of the case, Kuhn's optography results, and more. You can also see the photos and source links for this episode on the episode blog on my website at agoodnightforamurder.com. The bonus content for Patreon members for this episode is more cases where forensic optography was deployed, and if any of it actually helped. Listen through the outro music to hear a short preview of this Patreon bonus content. To subscribe to Patreon and learn more about the podcast, you can visit agoodnightforamurder.com. Also, follow me on Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube at A Good Night for a Murder. Please rate and review and share with friends. Thank you for listening, and I will talk to you again soon. And this is to accompany episode 46 about the last thing Sarah Jane Roberts saw, which was about the unsolved murder of domestic servant Sarah Jane Roberts and the use of retinal optography to solve her case. I'm going to tell you about some more cases where forensic retinal optography was deployed and if it ever actually worked. As a refresher from the regular episode, with no leads in the case of Sarah Jane Roberts' murder, police decided to try an experimental tactic to see if they could literally see what Sarah Jane saw right before she died. They would do this by removing her eyes and attempting to develop her last seen image like film from a camera. They were hopeful this would reveal some clue about her killer that they could then use to track them down. To us, this sounds like pure science fiction. But to the Victorians, it was plausible. The late 19th century in particular saw significant advances in science and technology, showing Victorians that the impossible was in fact possible. Early doctors saw the human eye operating with a lens and retina, almost like the lens and aperture of a camera, and thought, maybe those two things aren't so different. As discussed in the regular episode, a physiologist named William Frederick Kuhn was particularly keen to run down this theory based on prior work from 1876 by another physiologist, Franz Christian Boll. Boll discovered the presence of something called rhodopsin in our eyes. Now, I am not a physiologist, but so far as I can tell, this is what gives us our natural night vision. Also known as visual purple, it is a light-sensitive protein found in the retina of the eye that is responsible for mediating dim light vision. It's not only there in dim light when you need night vision, though, it's there all of the time, responding to whatever the lighting conditions currently are. So it's constantly fluctuating. And like anything else in our body, it stops working once we stop living. Kuhn, though, thought, what if, once your eyes stop working, we could find a way to grab whatever pattern the rhodopsin was in? Wouldn't that show us kind of a negative style image of what the eye saw right before everything faded to black, so to speak? Kuhn put his theory to the test on rabbits first, developing a procedure where the retinas of dead rabbits were washed with a solution of alum. From there, the pattern on the rabbit's retina would be photographed and enlarged, in theory, showing us what the rabbit saw at the time of its death. Now, if you're an animal lover, this will hurt your heart. He did his experiments by locking a live rabbit in place so he could know firsthand what the rabbit was looking at when he killed the rabbit. I know, I'm sorry. He actually did have some success with this, though, or so he claims at least. In his most famous image, the one I shared on Instagram and in the episode blog on my website, Kuhn claimed he was able to capture the image of a barred window the rabbit was looking at right before it died. I mean, maybe there's definitely some shapes in there. Without seeing the actual window as a human sees it, it's hard to tell though. What's more, this technique was really only successful if applied to, as Kuhn put it, freshly dead retinas. He had the opportunity to attempt his experiment on human retinas in 1880. In a nearby town on November 16th of that year, Erhard Gustav Rief was to be executed by guillotine for the murder of his children. Immediately following the execution, his eyes were extracted and delivered to Kuhn's laboratory at the University of Heidelberg. Kuhn produced an image which he believed to be the blade of the guillotine. While the actual optogram did not survive, we have a drawing of it, which I also shared on Instagram and the episode blog on my website. Now, I'm not sure if this was meant to be kind of a test for Kuhn, but apparently Rief was blindfolded at the time of his beheading, meaning he didn't see much of anything right before his death. So why even do this experiment? I'm not sure. But anyway, the law enforcement community was still pretty excited at the possibility of forensic optography. In London in 1888, forensic optography was used in the investigation of the murders of two victims of Jack the Ripper, Annie Chapman and Mary Jane Kelly. Press coverage mentioned the use of retina optography in the case of Annie Chapman, and for Mary Jane Kelly, noted Inspector Walter Dew later stated in his memoirs that forensic optography had been used in the, quote, forlorn hope of identifying her killer. Though the results did not contribute anything in either investigation, by 1895, the practice had caught on in the United States as well. It was reported that it is an old idea that the image formed on the retina of the eye remains fixed after death, and that the time will come when a murderer will be identified by the unerring photograph fixed on the eye of his victim. The idea, long dormant, is now being revived in America. 2 women have been murdered in Jamestown, New York, by an unknown assassin, and a microscopic examination having been made of the eyes of the women, it is said that in one case there is a distinct picture of a man on the retina. Unfortunately, it did not give the murderer's face, but his form is said to be distinct and his clothes recognizable, even to the wrinkles in his trousers. Further details will be awaited with much interest. The theory was tested again in another notable case, that of 19-year-old Teresa Holland in Illinois.